Welcome. This is a short information class called How to Hold a Business Meeting. This class is intended to support Community of Christ congregations in the Coastal Bend Mission Center. My name is Jim Burdick. I'm on the Mission Center President team, and what I present are my thoughts and opinions and not officially authorized by Community of Christ. Thank you for being with us. In our class today, we will try to address the perspective of congregations of Community of Christ. Almost any social organization can and does hold business meetings, but congregations in the church have special needs, and we will try to discuss from that perspective. Also, there are issues a congregation might face that we won't address in this class, so that we may remain more general in our content. Our approach today will be to view some overall issues about business meetings and to look at some of the most common types or purposes of business meetings. We want to show that a business meeting is a process, not just an event. Our business meetings use Robert's Rules of Order to make them fair and efficient. And lastly, we will offer some hints for success and show some alternatives for your congregation's business meeting schedule during the year. That is quite a lot to discuss, so let's move forward. When we consider overall issues about business meetings, many issues are raised. It is essential that we advertise business meetings in advance. Typically, this involves the verbal and written announcements for 2 Sundays before the meeting. This would mean that a total of 3 Sundays are involved. If there is a special purpose or a main purpose, that should be announced when it is determined. For instance, we might state that we will hold a business meeting on October 10th to approve our budget. Please remember to prepare materials in advance. This would include printed motions, budget sheets, ballots, or reports to be considered. If you will be electing officers, this requires an independent chair. An independent chair actually takes the chair while the pastor is nominated and elected. This assures that the congregation is free to choose its will without feeling pressured by the current pastor. The Mission Center would like to offer one of its officers to do this. Every business meeting requires a secretary or acting secretary. In some congregations, the only elected officers might be pastor and secretary. Remember that financial officer, recorder, etc. are appointed and sustained, not elected. Every business meeting requires a quorum. The church was originally organized by 6 members on April 6, 1830. This is how I recall that the size of a quorum is 6 in our denomination. Lastly, one of the issues involved with business meetings is the methods of voting. It is most customary to have voice votes. Say aye, or hand votes, raise your hand, and these fit the practice of open voting where every member's vote is public. But a meeting can also use ballots, for instance with lists of nominees, or with serial selection of nominees for positions with multiple openings such as boards. Let's take a look at this special situation. In the event you have multiple positions to fill, let's say 3, and you accept nominations and get, say, 5 nominees. The proper way to fill this would be to hold a series of 3 individual elections. First, you vote on all 5 nominees to fill position 1, and the top voted candidate wins position 1. In this case, we put Tom in position 1 and remove him from the nominee list, so only 4 remain. Then you vote on position 2, but you only consider Sam, Gloria, Grace, and Sally. In our example, Gloria wins, so she goes to position 2, and we strike her name from the nominees. Finally, we vote on position 3, but we only consider Sam, Grace, and Sally. In our example, Sally wins the 3rd position. In summary, we only took 1 list of nominees, and we only filled 1 position at a time with a shrinking list of nominees. This is the proper and most fair way to complete this type of an election. Some congregations have very few business meetings, while others have different types of meetings. This is not an exhaustive list, but there can be at least 2 major types of business meetings, a general or a special meeting. These are my descriptors for a level of complexity. From my description, a general business meeting is one where there is old business, which is usually expected and understood, and new business, which may include unknown and unexpected content. A special business meeting, on the other hand, is one that has an identified, defined purpose, and there will not be new business raised. A great example of this might be a business meeting for approving calls to the priesthood. This would be an excellent time to not have new business, which might include motions and discussion about painting the refrigerator orange. The biggest factor to consider what type you are looking at is the unexpected nature of new business. By and large, one piece of advice, it would seem that it would take time and even waste time. But if any new business is raised, take time to have the mover write down a specific motion. If discussion raises amendments, stop and write those down as well when they are raised. It will help mightily if all discussion and voting is over a tangible, known statement. Now, there are other factors that can affect your meeting, and these include having a special purpose to the business meeting. There are unique issues for election of officers, budget approval, and organizational or administrative changes. For instance, in electing officers, please have an accurate list of the current officers and stress that nominations must have pre-approval of the nominee. At budget meetings, please have the current and the proposed budgets both printed up and available to all present. Perhaps even have these available well in advance. For administrative or organizational meetings, have tangible proposals printed and available, such as if we are considering renting our parking lot to a local business. A successful business meeting is a process more than a single event. Let's look at that. Plan your business meeting. Planning starts well before your first announcement. You should have a general idea of the goals of the meeting before you begin announcing it. When you announce your business meeting, it is good to give reasonable detail. For example, on May 17th, we will have a business meeting to consider calls to the priesthood for Mary Brown to the office of priest and Rick Green to the office of teacher. There ought to be enough information to answer most questions. You may have already begun, but not much later, you should start to develop the minutes of your business meeting. You do that by imagining how a meeting would progress if it were to have the outcome that you expect. Place the events in the general format of a typical business meeting, leaving a blank or blanks in all the places where the details are not known or that may vary. Given the minutes that are expected, you can actually develop a script of what the chair would need to say to cause those minutes to take place. For example, I would literally write, I call this meeting to order at blank time, p.m. on February the 16th. I make my scripts in an MS Word document using a table format where each row is a step. At each step, I insert what the secretary needs to observe and let him take notes on that script. These notes are examined afterwards and placed appropriately into the minutes developed earlier. It is important that the minutes and script are in sync. Once synchronized, minutes and script are set. Take the major steps in the script and create the general high-level outline that develops the agenda. We will look at some examples of an agenda later. When you conduct your meeting, you basically read your script, and the secretary and the chair, that's you, put notes in the blanks as you move forward. You will be surprised how good you can get at creating scripts that accomplish the goals that you've set. After the meeting, the chair, again that's you, and the secretary cooperate at transferring the script notes into the minutes. When this is done, publish the minutes for approval. Sometimes this is done by public announcement and responses, and sometimes by reading and responses at the next business meeting. If it is known, it is wise to schedule the next business meeting with whatever detail is appropriate, such as this meeting will be adjourned until our election of officers meeting this fall. I hope that this has shown how successful business meeting is more of an event. It is a process of efforts that work together toward the desired goals. Now I am going to go out on a limb and guess that this slide is what you thought the whole class might be about, Robert's Rules of Order. In actuality, this is a very important slide, but the other slides are equally critical. Remember that there are people whose entire profession is to be professional parliamentarians. I'm not one of those, and I'll bet that you are also not. But we can use this time to help all of us rookies with some basics. Basic definitions and concepts can go a long way. First, every meeting has a chair and the floor. The chair is the person running the meeting, either completely or temporarily. In Community of Christ, this person is usually the pastor, but can be someone designated to operate in this capacity. By definition, the chair has the floor, or the right to speak. The chair gives the right to speak to others. She gives them the floor, but retains the right to control the floor. There are careful protections of the meeting to control the chair, but this is getting esoteric. Every meeting needs a secretary. This is usually the elected congregation secretary, but it can also be someone appointed for the duration of the meeting. Not all congregations have a parliamentarian. but there should be someone that the chair and the meeting mutually recognize as the authority they will turn to for final decisions of parliamentary questions. If you do not have anyone experienced in parliamentary procedure, please pick someone that all people know to be very fair. One of the most basic rules of parliamentary procedure is that there is only one motion at a time. This is basically true in spite of what will seem like contradictions. Basically, a motion consists of someone proposing an action, such as, I move that we rename every Tuesday as Jim's Day for no particular reason. Now, this is not a motion yet, but when it receives a second, it becomes a motion. A second means at least one other member of the meeting supports the motion. After it has been moved and seconded, that motion has the floor. No other motion can be introduced unless it is a subsidiary to the main motion. An example might be a motion to amend that also has a second, etc. At that time, discussion on the first motion stops, and the motion to amend has the floor, and all discussion must be about the new motion. Once the motion to amend is solved, the initial motion, perhaps that's as amended if appropriate, returns to have the floor. Normally, there are only two types of votes, majority or two-thirds votes. A majority vote is where there are more in favor than opposed, or vice versa. Whichever has the larger number prevails. For instance, if we have 37 people there, 14 to 13 prevails in favor, and 17 to 19 prevails against, and 16 to 16 is a tie. The chair can vote in the case of a tie. In a two-thirds votes, there must be two-thirds of voters voting to prevail. Again, using an attendance of 37, a vote of 20 to 17 fails. A vote of 21 to 10 prevails. 8 to 3 prevails, but note that that means 26 people did not vote. Let's take a look at some common parliamentary actions. It might be helpful to make a copy of a chart similar to this and hand out to all members of a business meeting so that all the participants use common understanding about parliamentary procedures. One pattern that everyone should understand is the pattern for a basic motion. That pattern is a motion leads to a second, which leads to discussion, sometimes called debate, and that leads to a vote. A lot of times people want to make a motion and go directly to the vote or directly to the debate without waiting for a second. Or they want to debate before they have the second and then have the vote, and that doesn't work. The minutes should capture who the mover is by name, but only need to note the fact that a second was heard. They don't need the name. The discussion should be with the rule of alternates, and the vote should generally be public. Let's continue with our observations of Robert's Rules of Order. We were just to the point of superseding or interrupting motions. Recalling that only one motion can be on the floor at a time, this would be one of the main motions. After there is a motion on the floor, only subsidiary motions or privileged motions may be brought. A subsidiary motion, like amending the current motion or the main motion, would be generally allowed, and the interruption of a privileged motion, such as a complaint about the meetings itself, perhaps I rise to a question of privilege, the PA system seems to have failed and we can't hear. Those interruptions would be allowed. These motions take precedent and take the floor. Not all motions allow debate, but if they do, and sometimes that's called discussion, but if they do, some good guidelines are that a person that speaks should not speak again until everyone has had a chance to speak once. It is becoming normal in Community of Christ to speak in alternates. That is, after a speaker supporting, yield to a speaker opposing, and then repeat this process. You are the chair. It is your responsibility to assure that debate does not get personal or back and forth, one speaker at a time. Debate, discussion always needs to relate to the current motion and only that motion. Lastly, be careful to not abuse this, but sometimes the exact parliamentary words elude us. Sometimes we can get away with use of the phrase without objection. For instance, if we forget how to move accepting of minutes, it might be okay to state, since there have been no corrections to the minutes, if there is no objection, the chair will declare the minutes accepted as read. Or, without objection, we will put off the motion to amend the budget until the financial officer returns to the meeting from his phone call. Without objection can move things along that are otherwise tricky to do when it is clearly the consensus. But if someone has an objection, even one person, it needs to be that we fall back to the technically correct procedure. Some hints for success might be worth mentioning. It has been Mission Center policy to support congregations by sending a member of leadership to support congregational conferences. We used to call these branch business meetings, so either term works, though the official term is Congregational Conference. Please use this resource freely and arrange for a Mission Center representative to attend your meeting. It is so important to properly announce your business meeting. It would be rare, but if someone complained and a meeting had not been properly announced, it could result in a negated business meeting and the need for a new conference. Remember to use the rule of alternates during discussion or debate. This practice is fair. It actually tends to shorten debate or discussion, and it tends to turn actual debate into actual discussion. Remember that either support or opposition can be first, but alternate between both sides until your time limit is reached or when there is nobody wanting to add new thoughts. Another way that discussion might end is by somebody moving the previous question. Sometimes this is used to squash the minority thought, and it is the right of the body and requires a 2/3 vote. But establishing a rule of alternates tradition might temper the desire to jump quickly to moving the previous question. It is very common, and it is not underhanded or wrong, for the chair to plant movers of motions in advance to move desired motion. Do this and equip the mover with a written copy of the motion to deliver to the secretary. In addition, the mover may add, "I move this motion, and if it receives a second, I would like to speak to the motion." This generally gives a prepared person an opportunity to explain the intent of the motion and begins the rule of alternates process. Always remember that the guiding principle is that there is only one motion on the floor at a time. In your mind, keep your focus on that motion. Your congregation conferences can and should be part of your annual calendar. You do see that I made a change there, I hope. I substituted congregational conference for business meeting. Well, congregational situations vary, and scheduling methods will also vary. First, let us look at a congregation that is rather good-sized and has a fair amount of business to conduct each year. The schedule starts in August or early September when a business meeting is scheduled to elect delegates to the Mission Center Conference. These must be reported to the Mission Center before the middle of September for the Mission Center Conference the first Saturday in October. The next congregation conference or business meeting is to elect officers for the next church year. This congregation runs on a January to December year. Some congregations use alternate church years. This is a conference that is important to have a Mission Center representative help with. After the new officers have worked out budget needs and program desires, the congregation schedules a conference or business meeting to approve the budget for the coming year. And finally, the congregation may require a spring conference or business meeting for business that occurs, such as priesthood calls, or working with renters, or considering camperships, etc. The point here is not that you must have this many congregation conferences at these times, but you might be helped by structuring these into your congregation calendar. For instance, every year, the third Sunday in August, the second Sunday in October, and these can just be well planned well in advance. Even in smaller congregations, your congregational conferences can and should be part of your annual calendar. As I mentioned before, congregational situations vary and scheduling methods will also vary. Now, let's look at a congregation that is smaller sized and has less business to conduct each year. In this case, the same things are generally addressed as the larger congregation, but in a more compressed time frame. Perhaps the first congregational conference is scheduled for the last Sunday in August, and it addresses both the election of officers and the election of Mission Center delegates. The congregation needs to approve a budget, and that might be on the second Sunday in December. Finally, in some situations, a congregation may do all of its business in one meeting and may schedule the first Sunday in September to have a conference that addresses all of its needs. I think you may still benefit from the advice in this class. The bottom line in scheduling is that, regardless of the size of your congregation or the complexity of your business, it is wise to establish a pattern so that year after year your conferences are predictable and effective. Earlier, I mentioned showing a sample business meeting agenda. This is a brief structure of common business meeting contents at a high level. It is pretty straightforward, but I will try to hit a few points about each item. The call to order is essential, the official first step, and it is necessary. I would advise a simple statement with the name of the church, the name of the chair, the time, the date, and the location of the meeting. For example, it might be, I call this meeting to order at 12:15 p.m. May 17th in the San Antonio Community of Christ. My name is Jim Burdick, Chair. There is no rule that you have to have an invocation, but conducting the church's business is an act of worship that deserves to be taken as a spiritual behavior, just as a conventional worship service is. I try to have an independent, that means non-officer, leader of the congregation offer the invocation. Approval of the minutes is a fairly perfunctory exercise. There are seldom huge changes or discrepancies, but this does demonstrate that we take seriously the continuity of our business practices. Approval can be as official as creating a motion and voting, or in some cases can be declared approved without objection. There are also times when approval of the minutes might be deferred until the next conference. Of these three options just mentioned, the proper choice is to move and vote on the approval. Old business is generally the meaning of the conference. This is the known activity that you called the meeting to do. Actions like electing officers, considering priesthood calls, approving budgets, etc., all fall under the umbrella of planned business. Essentially, you will always have old business in every conference. Congregations vary, but many congregations do receive reports from various sources. If your congregation does this, you can make a recognized period for this. In some reports, it might be appropriate for the conference to act on the report by moving approval and voting for approval. Some reports are essentially information only in nature. Of all the items in a conference, one of the trickiest can be new business. This is because of the unknown and unpredictable nature of new business. You've heard me say this before. There are things that might help with the trickiness. For one, make it practice that all motions must be written down. In fact, take time to allow a motion to be written out. It will save time in the long run. Another help would be to reiterate that only one motion may be considered at a time. It is common for someone to move that the organ be painted green, and during that discussion, someone tries to move that the kitchen should be carpeted, and this can get very confusing. Remember, one motion at a time. But the one thing that helps most is to remember that you do not need to have new business in all meetings, particularly if you provide ways for including well-planned motions in advance so that they can essentially be part of old business. The final item to discuss is the move to adjourn. This is a simple motion, a second, and a vote. Some special business meeting actions are worthy of a few comments. When a conference considers approval of ordinations, keep in mind that this is currently both an administrative action and a very spiritual action. I recommend that you accept a single motion to approve all the calls, if there is more than one, but that you will need to vote on and discuss each call individually. After it is seconded, you can offer time for each person to accept their call and share their own experience. Encourage free expression of all calls by everyone present. I usually say, without objection, we will extend voice to all present for the discussion of these calls. After sufficient discussion, return to the motion and explain that we will vote on each call individually. Ask for a vote in favor, a vote in opposition, and declare each person approved, assuming that is the case, individually. It is the right of a conference to determine its makeup or membership. In that respect, a conference can define who has voice and/or vote in the deliberations. Put simply, voice is the right to speak and vote is the right to vote. This can be a simple process of motion, second, discuss, and vote, or in certain cases by declaration. You might recall that our old friendly phrase, without objection. It's essentially the conference can extend voice, vote, or voice and vote to classes of people, special groups of people, specific groups of people, or specific individuals. Major budget issues can cause sticking points. Moving slowly and clearly may help, but in many cases it is beneficial to have listening circle type of open discussions, perhaps even weeks in advance, and well in advance. Another thing that might ease issues is to have clear and consistent documents. The friendly rule of alternates can also ease discussion and lessen debate. The last special business meeting actions that should be considered is polarizing topics. These happen. They cannot always be avoided. When we know a polarizing topic is going to be raised, again, it is beneficial to have listening circle type of open discussions well in advance, perhaps for weeks. Sometimes more than one is required. Make every attempt to not allow sides or factions to develop. If possible, employ some of the worship aspects that are used in considering ordinations. Thank you for taking this class. We hope to see you again for other classes in the future.